We're going for a drive in this installment of the Atari Archive with Indy 500. When the Atari VCS launched in 1977, there were two racing games that went out alongside it. The one we're focusing on this time around is Indy 500, almost without question the better of the two, and features some of the best racing action on the platform. The other, Street Racer, we'll be covering later. Like all the other games we've covered so far, Indy 500 is a home version of not one, but two Atari arcade games, Indy 800 and Indy 4. The two arcade machines, clearly named in homage for the annual Indianapolis 500 race, are incredibly similar. But the key difference is the number of players. Indy 800 allows up to 8 players to compete against each other simultaneously, while Indy 4 whittles that down to 4 players. In either game, players take hold of steering wheels and try to maneuver their car around a track completing laps. Crashing or going off-road will slow a driver down immensely until they can get back on the road. The overhead perspective and game mechanics were pioneered by Atari in its 1974 arcade game and first true racing game, Grand Track 10, to which Indy 800 was something of a sequel. The screen is in the center of the arcade console, with mirrors showcasing the action to passers-by. The massive Indy machines took up a lot of floor space and aren't terribly easy to come by today. Luckily, a two-player rendition of these games exists on the Atari VCS. Indy 500, also released as Race by Sears, doesn't capture the multiplayer chaos that its arcade siblings bring with them. But the finest Atari VCS arcade ports never pull every element of the arcade game together. Rather, the developers look at the game, figure out what the most important or notable aspects of the arcade original, and determine what they can cut and what needs to remain for the game to be recognizably what it is. It's an interpretive style that started with combat, and it really shines here. In the case of Indy 500, programmer Ed Riddle recognized the VCS's limits and reduced the number of players to 2, and swapped out the gigantic arcade tracks in favor of something that would be legible on any size screen, not just the 25-inch arcade monitors used in Indy 800 and Indy 4. Notably, Indy 500 is also the only commercially released VCS game to use the driving controllers, which were packed in with the game. The driving controllers use a rotary encoder instead of a potentiometer like the paddle controllers. These offer full 360-degree rotation and provide each player with 16 angles of precision on which way they want to turn their car. Riddle assigned the sole controller button as the accelerator, with the top speed available adjusted with the difficulty switches on the game console. In an interview with the 2600 Game by Game podcast, Riddle said when he was hired in 1977, he had been instructed to program a game even though he had never done any programming before. His background was in engineering and building phone switching boxes prior to joining Atari. He was given documentation by Larry Wagner, learned to program, and started coming up with the different game variations to include on the cart. Riddle decided on 4 major game variants. The first, Race Car, allows players to race either the clock in a one-player time trial mode or go head-to-head in a race to finish 25 laps on either a Grand Prix track or the Devil's Elbow route. These are pretty standard racing games that best carry over the arcade game experiences. In Crash and Score, players maneuver around one of 2 tracks trying to ram into a white square to score points, either in a timed game or in a first to 50 points version. The game is surprisingly hectic as players veer wildly to hit the square or knock their opponent off course at the last moment. The tag variant reuses the Crash and Score tracks, starting one player off as it, scoring a point for every second they are blinking. Once the other player rams them, they become it, and begin racking up points, with the goal of reaching 99 points first. While tag games date back to the original Magnavox Odyssey, Indy 500 puts together one of the more interesting renditions thanks to the playfields each car has to maneuver around. For the driver being pursued, the dirt patches provide a handy obstacle to slow down their opponent, while the pursuer can try and trap their target by leading them to crash into a wall, slowing down and giving them a chance to tag. Finally, Riddle included an ice race variant, which included an early example of what have become known as ice physics. In those game types, the cars will skid around loosely when turning, lacking the traction a clear road would provide. Much like the standard race game types, these are either played in a time trial version or in a 2-player race. Riddle considered learning to do the ice physics one of his favorite experiences while developing the game, and it's pretty impressive to see your car careening off course if you try to take a turn at too high a speed or too sharp an angle in a 1977 release. because it came packed in with the two driving controllers, Indy 500 sold for double the price of other VCS games at launch. Indy 500 sold for $39.95, a steep jump above the $19.95 all other VCS games were on the market for. But without the driving controllers to act as a steering wheel, Indy 500 doesn't work very well. Atari revisited that style of game with 1986's Super Sprint arcade game, which received its own Atari VCS port in 1989 near the end of the console's commercial life, under the title Sprint Master. While Sprint Master is a prettier game with power-ups and more complex tracks, steering within a standard Atari joystick is more difficult and far less intuitive than simply turning the driving controller knob. It's actually kind of unfortunate, as the VCS played host to a number of racing games, and many of them could have been adapted effectively to the driving controller. On the other hand, in the years since Indy 500 came out, we've seen many times over that if a controller or accessory isn't packed in with a game system from the get-go, it's much less likely to see a whole lot of support simply because the potential sales base is going to be that much smaller. So in a sense, Indy 500 also pioneered the genre of good games that require you to dig out a specific controller. On the flip side, while the driving controller makes it a breeze to steer, it's not as comfortable to use as one would want. Since players constantly have to hold down the button to keep their speed up, it's incredibly easy to develop a hand cramp after even one race. My partner and I were feeling the effects pretty quickly, and it makes me wonder if it would have made more sense for the button to serve as a brake, similar to what Nintendo would end up doing with Kirby's Air Ride more than 25 years later. Also, the game seems really finicky about detecting when someone has completed a lap. At one point, my partner went around the track close to 10 times without the game recognizing it. Indy 500 wasn't the only racing game of its type on the home market. The RCA Studio 2 played host to Speedway, an Indy 500 style game written by Joyce Weisbecker. Like Indy 500, Speedway came out in 1977 and features two blocks representing cars racing around the singular track to reach 9 laps. Without the rotary controls that Indy 500 uses, the two cars can only move in 4 cardinal directions around the track, gradually picking up speed until they crash into a wall or each other. Maneuvering using the Studio 2's keypads is surprisingly tricky to master, and even the manual suggests positioning your hands in a specific way to limit hitting the wrong keys. Coincidentally, a tag game also by Weisbecker was included on the card as well. Speedway Tag isn't as complete a package as Indy 500, but it's an interesting piece of convergent evolution and highlights the gulf between what Atari was doing and its early competitors. Before leaving Atari, Riddle worked on a follow-up to Indy 500 that he called Roach Wars, where cockroaches ran around the ground dropping things behind them, but it went unreleased and a prototype has unfortunately never turned up. Even without that pseudo-sequel, Indy 500 still has managed to hold a following today. The website Atari Age has 2 distinct hacks of the game, featuring a variety of new tracks for fans to cruise around, and hackers have added driving controller support to Sprint Master too. And for modern racing game fans, the game's driving controllers really are the ancestors to the steering wheel controllers that started springing up on home consoles with the ColecoVision. Future racing games on the platform may have added power-ups or shifted perspectives, but Indy 500, for all its little flaws, is one of the standouts of the VCS's 1977 lineup. Next time on Atari Archive, we take the incredibly odd street racer out on the road to win races and run over numbers.